Hello again, dear listener. You've arrived at the perfect time for a story from the past, told gently and slowly as night wraps itself around us. Whether you're easing into sleep or simply seeking a soft pause from the day, I'm grateful to be part of your routine. Let me know where you're listening from. Are you watching the sunrise? Or is the moon hanging outside your window as it is mine? If these calm historical narratives bring you peace, I invite you to subscribe and come along for many more. Most people think they know Catherine de' Medici. They've heard the whispers about the Poison Queen, the Italian sorceress who supposedly murdered her way to power. They imagine a cackling witch brewing deadly potions in some dark tower. But the real Catherine was far more complex, far more brilliant, and far more terrifying than any fairy tale villain. What I'm about to reveal will completely change how you see one of history's most controversial queens. We're going to uncover the truth behind the legends, explore the brutal world that shaped her, and discover how a powerless foreign girl became the most influential woman in 16th century Europe. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why Catherine de' Medici wasn't just surviving in a man's world. She was mastering it. But first, let me paint you a picture of the world Catherine was born into, because without understanding the violence and chaos of Renaissance Italy, you can't possibly comprehend the monster it created. The year was 1519, and Europe was a powder keg ready to explode. Wars raged across the continent as kings and emperors carved up territories like pieces of meat. In Italy, city-states battled each other with ruthless efficiency, while foreign armies marched through their lands like locusts. This wasn't the romantic renaissance of art and poetry that we read about in textbooks. This was a blood-soaked era where political survival meant embracing brutality as a virtue. Into this chaos was born Catherine de' Medici, daughter of one of the most powerful banking families in Europe. The Medici name commanded respect and fear in equal measure. They had bought their way into nobility, funded wars, and toppled governments with nothing more than carefully placed loans and strategic marriages. But power in Renaissance Italy was as fragile as spun glass, and the Medici family was about to learn this lesson in the cruelest way possible. Catherine's father, Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, died when she was just 6 days old. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, followed him to the grave 3 weeks later. In an instant, baby Catherine became an orphan, but not just any orphan. She was an orphan with a massive inheritance and a name that made her valuable to anyone seeking power. Picture this scene: a crying infant surrounded by vultures in expensive clothing, each one calculating how they could use this tiny girl to advance their own ambitions. Catherine's uncle, Pope Leo X, took control of her guardianship, but even papal protection couldn't shield her from the brutal realities of Renaissance politics. When Catherine was 8 years old, her world exploded into violence. The citizens of Florence, tired of Medici rule, rose up in rebellion. They stormed through the streets, hunting down anyone connected to the family that had controlled their city for generations. Catherine found herself trapped in a convent, not for religious reasons, but because it was the only place her guardians thought she might survive the bloodlust of an angry mob. But survival wasn't guaranteed. The rebels wanted her dead, viewing this small child as a symbol of everything they despised about Medici tyranny. Some suggested throwing her from the city walls. Others proposed chaining her to the battlements as a human shield when the papal armies came to retake Florence. This 8-year-old girl was already learning the most important lesson of her life. In a world where men held all the power, a woman's survival depended entirely on her ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and when necessary, out-cruel her enemies. For 2 years, Catherine remained a prisoner in that convent, while armies clashed outside the walls. She watched nuns pray for peace, while soldiers sharpened their swords for war. She learned that mercy was a luxury only the strong could afford, and strength came not from muscle or sword, but from the cold calculation of a mind that could see 3 moves ahead of everyone else. When the papal forces finally retook Florence in 1530, 11-year-old Catherine emerged from her convent prison fundamentally changed. The fright who had entertained child was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival meant never again being powerless. She had seen what happened to those who trusted in the goodness of others, and she would never make that mistake. But Catherine's trials were far from over. Her survival had made her valuable, and valuable people in Renaissance Europe were rarely allowed to choose their own destiny. Pope Clement VII, her great-uncle, had been watching the political chessboard of Europe and had identified the perfect move to advance Medici interests. Catherine would be married to Henri, the second son of King Francis I of France. This wasn't a romantic fairy tale. This was a business transaction, written in blood and sealed with gold. The French crown needed Medici money to fund their endless wars against the Holy Roman Empire. The Medici needed French protection to secure their hold on power in Italy. Catherine, now 14 years old, was simply the coin that sealed the deal. On October 28, 1533, Catherine married Henri in a ceremony that was as much about displaying wealth as celebrating love. The wedding festivities cost more than some kingdoms' annual revenues, with guests gorging themselves on exotic delicacies, while musicians played and courtiers danced. But beneath the silk and gold, everyone understood the brutal mathematics of the arrangement. Catherine had brought a dowry that could fund armies, and in return, she had purchased a place in the most dangerous court in Europe. The French court was a nest of vipers wrapped in velvet and jewels. Every conversation was a potential trap, every friendship a calculated alliance, every meal a chance for an enemy to slip poison into your wine. Nobles spent their days crafting elaborate schemes to gain the king's favour, while simultaneously plotting the downfall of their rivals. It was a world where a misplaced word could end in exile or execution, where today's closest ally could become tomorrow's executioner. Catherine arrived at this court as a foreign outsider with no natural allies and a husband who showed her nothing but cold indifference. Henri was already infatuated with Diane de Poitiers, a woman 19 years his senior who would remain his mistress for the rest of his life. While other teenage brides might have retreated into despair or self-pity, Catherine began studying her new environment with the calculating eye of a general surveying a battlefield. She observed how power flowed through the corridors of the royal palace. She noted which nobles held real influence and which were merely decorative. She learned the intricate web of family alliances that determined who lived in luxury and who found themselves mysteriously dead in their beds. Most importantly, she began to understand that in the French court, information was more valuable than gold, and the person who knew everyone's secrets held everyone's fate in their hands. For 10 years, Catherine played the role of the dutiful but barren wife. She endured the whispered rumours about her inability to produce an heir, the cruel jokes about the Italian banker's daughter who couldn't even manage to get pregnant. Courtiers speculated openly about when Henri would set her aside for a more fertile bride. Some even suggested she should voluntarily enter a convent to spare everyone the embarrassment of a formal annulment. But Catherine wasn't planning to disappear quietly into religious obscurity. While her enemies plotted her downfall, she was building something far more dangerous than they could imagine. She was creating a network of spies, allies, and debtors that would eventually span all of Europe. Every act of kindness, every favour granted, every secret kept was an investment in her future power. Catherine understood what her enemies didn't. Patience was the ultimate weapon. While they focused on immediate gains and short-term victories, she was playing a game that would unfold over decades. She knew that in a world where men died young from wars, duels, and mysterious illnesses, the person who could wait, watch, and survive would ultimately inherit everything. In 1544, everything changed. After 11 years of marriage, Catherine finally became pregnant. The French court held its breath as the Italian woman they had dismissed and mocked carried the future of the Valois dynasty in her womb. When she gave birth to a son, Francis, the same nobles who had been planning her removal suddenly found themselves bowing before the mother of the heir to the French throne. But Catherine had learned too much about the nature of power to believe that one successful pregnancy would guarantee her security. She continued to build her network, continued to gather secrets, continued to position herself as indispensable to anyone who wanted to survive in the brutal world of French politics. Over the next 13 years, she would bear 9 more children, but by then, her value extended far beyond her ability to produce heirs. The woman who had once been dismissed as a powerless Italian orphan was now becoming something far more dangerous, a political mastermind who understood that true power came not from the throne you sat on, but from the invisible strings you pulled to make others dance to your tune. Catherine's transformation from vulnerable outsider to master manipulator didn't happen overnight. While the French court celebrated the birth of her children, she was quietly orchestrating something far more sinister. Every smile she offered, every gift she bestowed, every conversation she engaged in was carefully calculated to serve a larger purpose that no one else could see. The first person to truly understand Catherine's growing power was Diane de Poitiers herself. Henri's longtime mistress had initially viewed the Italian princess as nothing more than an inconvenient broodmare, useful for producing heirs, but irrelevant to the real business of governing France. But as years passed, Diane began to notice something unsettling about Catherine's behaviour. Where other court ladies gossiped openly about their rivals, Catherine listened more than she spoke. Where others formed obvious alliances based on family connections, or rated relationships that regional loyalties Catherine cultivated seemed random, but were actually strategically brilliant. She befriended the wives of minor nobles who had access to important information. She maintained correspondence with Italian merchants who travelled throughout Europe carrying more than just goods in their wagons. Most unnervingly, she seemed to know things about people that they had never told anyone. Consider the case of Antoine de Bourbon, Duke of Vendôme, a man who thought himself clever enough to play multiple sides in the complex game of French court politics. Antoine had been secretly negotiating with Spanish agents while publicly supporting French interests, believing his double-dealing would position him perfectly regardless of which side ultimately won. He was wrong. One evening, during what appeared to be casual dinner conversation, Catherine mentioned how much she admired Spanish leather goods, particularly those that came through certain trading routes that Antoine had been using to pass messages to enemy agents. She spoke innocently about the quality of Spanish craftsmanship, about how certain merchants seemed to have such excellent connections that they could acquire the most exclusive items. Antoine's face went pale as he realized that Catherine wasn't making small talk. She was letting him know that she knew exactly what he had been doing. But Catherine didn't expose Antoine. Instead, she smiled sweetly and changed the subject to something completely mundane, leaving him to sweat through the rest of the evening, wondering when the axe would fall. It never did. Instead, Antoine found himself inexplicably drawn into Catherine's orbit, attending her salons, seeking her advice on matters that had nothing to do with politics, and gradually becoming one of her most reliable sources of information about other nobles' secret activities. This became Catherine's signature method of operation. She didn't destroy her enemies. She converted them into unwilling allies by demonstrating that she possessed the power to destroy them while choosing not to exercise it. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, creating a network of people who owed their continued existence to her discretion. The Italian methods Catherine employed were foreign to the French court, which still operated under older, more direct forms of political maneuvering. French nobles were accustomed to settling disputes through duels, open confrontation, or appeals to royal authority. They understood threats that came with drawn swords or formal declarations of enmity. What they couldn't comprehend was Catherine's approach of turning their own secrets into chains that bound them to her will. Take the mysterious case of the Count de Saint-Pol, a man who had been vocal in his criticism of Italian influence at the French court. Saint-Pol made no secret of his belief that Catherine was an unwelcome foreign presence who had corrupted French traditions with her strange customs practices. He openly mocked her accent and suspicious her fashion choices and what he called her unnatural interest in books and learning. Saint-Pol's attitude changed dramatically after he received a small gift from Catherine, a beautifully illuminated manuscript about the history of noble families in northern France. When he opened it, he found that someone had made careful annotations in the margins, noting discrepancies between the official genealogies and certain church records that suggested his own family's claims to nobility might not withstand careful scrutiny. The implications were terrifying. If questions were raised about his bloodline, Saint-Pol could lose everything: his titles, his lands, his position at court, even his life. But the manuscript came with a note written in Catherine's elegant handwriting, expressing her hope that he would find the historical research as fascinating as she did, and mentioning how much she valued the preservation of noble traditions and the protection of established families. The message was clear. She could destroy him, but she preferred to have him as an ally rather than an enemy. Within weeks, Saint-Pol had transformed from Catherine's harshest critic into one of her most devoted supporters. He began praising her wisdom, her grace, and her dedication to French interests. Other nobles noticed the change and began to wonder what Catherine might know about their own carefully hidden secrets. The brilliance of Catherine's system was that it created a climate of fear without requiring her to actually harm anyone. People began censoring themselves, avoiding actions that might draw her attention, and competing to gain her favor rather than risk her displeasure. She had weaponized paranoia, turning the court's natural tendency towards suspicion and gossip into a tool that served her purposes. But Catherine's most masterful manipulation involved her relationship with her own husband. Henri's devotion to Diane de Poitiers was complete and public, a humiliation that would have driven most wives to desperate measures. Instead, Catherine turned her husband's infidelity into an asset by positioning herself as the wise, patient, understanding wife who never complained about circumstances beyond her control. While Diane focused on maintaining Henri's romantic attention, Catherine concentrated on making herself indispensable to his political success. She managed his correspondence with foreign dignitaries, using her family's banking connections to arrange favorable loans for military campaigns, and provided him with intelligence about potential threats to his rule. Henri began to rely on Catherine's judgment even as he continued to share his bed with Diane. The arrangement suited Catherine perfectly. Diane could have Henri's heart and body, but Catherine was quietly claiming something far more valuable: his dependence on her political acumen. She understood that passion endures, aids, but necessity. A king might tire of his mistress, but he would never willingly give up someone who helped him keep his throne. Catherine's children became additional tools in her expanding arsenal of influence. Rather than simply viewing them as heirs to be protected, she trained them from early childhood to serve as extensions of her will. She taught them languages, politics, and most importantly, the art of observation. Her sons and daughters learned to notice things that adults thought children wouldn't understand, to remember conversations that seemed unimportant, and to report back to their mother with information that she could use to further strengthen her position. Francis, her eldest son, became particularly skilled at this game. Even as a young child, he understood that his role was not just to be the future king, but to serve as his mother's eyes and ears in situations where she couldn't be present. He would play with the children of other noble families and return home with detailed reports about their parents' private conversations, their financial difficulties, their marital problems, and their political allegiances. The other royal children learned similar lessons. They discovered that information shared with Catherine's children had a way of becoming useful to Catherine herself, and that their mother's favour could make the difference between a family's rise court. And fall it soon, ambitious parents were instructing their own children to befriend Catherine's offspring, not realizing that they were essentially volunteer 1547 network. By of her intelligenceering to become part, when Henri finally ascended to the throne as Henri II, Catherine had transformed from a powerless foreign princess into the spider at the centre of a web that touched every corner of the French court. She knew which nobles were in debt and to whom they owed money. She knew which marriages were happy and which were maintained only for political convenience. She knew which courtiers were loyal to the crown and which were secretly negotiating with foreign powers. Most importantly, she had learned to hide her true capabilities behind a carefully constructed facade of feminine weakness and Italian emotionality. When courtiers saw Catherine, they saw what she wanted them to see: a devoted wife and mother who had been blessed with unusual political insight, but who remained fundamentally non-threatening because she was, after all, just a woman. This perception would prove to be Catherine's greatest weapon and her enemies' fatal miscalculation. They continued to underestimate her, even as she systematically dismantled their power bases and absorbed their resources into her own growing empire of influence. The stage was now set for the next phase of Catherine's rise to power. Henri II's reign would bring new challenges, new enemies, and new opportunities for a woman who had already proven that she could turn every disadvantage into a tool for advancing her agenda. But first, she would need to deal with the growing threat posed by religious warfare that was beginning to tear France apart at the seams. The religious wars that would define Catherine's reign began not with armies clashing on battlefields, but with a simple piece of paper nailed to a church door in Germany decades earlier. Martin Luther's challenge to Catholic authority had spread across Europe like wildfire, and by the time Henry II became king, France was splitting into two irreconcilable camps: Catholics who remained loyal to Rome, and Protestants who called themselves Huguenots. What made this conflict so dangerous wasn't just the theological disagreements, it was the way religious differences became weapons in the hands of ambitious nobles who saw an opportunity to challenge royal authority. The Duke of Guise, leader of the ultra-Catholic faction, wasn't just defending his faith when he persecuted Protestants. He was positioning himself as the true protector of France against heretical contamination, implying that any king who showed tolerance toward Huguenots was unfit to rule. On the other side, Protestant nobles like Admiral Gaspard de Coligny weren't just seeking religious freedom when they demanded rights for their congregations. They were building a power base that could challenge the traditional Catholic monarchy, creating a network of armed believers who owed their loyalty to God rather than king. Catherine watched this religious powder keg with the calculating eye of someone who understood that survival meant staying above the fray while secretly manipulating both sides. She had no deep religious convictions. Her faith was political expediency, wrapped in whatever theological language served her purposes. What she saw in the growing religious conflict wasn't a spiritual crisis requiring moral leadership, but an opportunity to make herself indispensable by becoming the only person who could navigate between warring factions. Her first test came when Henri decided to escalate the persecution of French Protestants. The king, influenced by his ultra-harsh measures against suspecting increasingly Catholic advisors, began a prod heretics. Public burnings became common spectacles, with crowds gathering to watch as men and women were reduced to ash for the crime of reading forbidden books or attending unauthorized religious services. Most queen consorts would have either supported their husband's policy or remained diplomatically silent. Catherine chose a third option. She quietly began reaching out to moderate Protestant leaders, not to support their cause, but to understand their capabilities and intentions. She wanted to know how many armed men they could field, which regions showed Protestant sympathies, and most importantly, whether their movement posed a genuine threat to royal authority or could be managed through careful negotiation. Through intermediaries, Catherine established communication with Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, and one of the most prominent Protestant nobles in France. Jeanne was everything Catherine appeared not to be: openly defiant of Catholic authority, willing to risk everything for her religious convictions, and completely transparent about her political goals. Their correspondence began as a careful diplomatic dance, with each woman testing the other's intentions while revealing as little as possible about their own strategic thinking. What emerged from these secret negotiations was a mutual recognition that both women were playing a game far more complex than simple religious devotion. Jeanne needed protection from Catholic persecution for her subjects and herself. Catherine needed intelligence about Protestant military capabilities and political planning. Neither woman trusted the other, but both understood that their interests occasionally aligned in ways that could benefit them both. Meanwhile, Catherine was simultaneously cultivating relationships with the ultra-Catholic faction led by the Guise family. Francis, Duke of Guise, was a military hero whose victories against foreign enemies had made him immensely popular with the common people and the army. His brother Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, controlled much of the church hierarchy in France and could influence papal policy toward the French monarchy. The Guise brothers represented everything Catherine had learned to fear: powerful men with independent sources of authority who didn't need royal favor to maintain their position. They commanded armies, controlled church appointments, and enjoyed popular support that could potentially challenge the monarchy itself. But they also had weaknesses that a careful observer could exploit. Francis de Guise's military reputation depended on continued success in warfare, which meant he needed the king's support for expensive military campaigns. Charles de Guise's ecclesiastical power required maintaining good relationships with Rome, which meant he couldn't afford to be seen as disloyal to a Catholic monarch. Catherine began working both angles, positioning herself as the person who could help the Guise family achieve their goals, while ensuring they remained dependent on royal support. The delicate balance Catherine was maintaining became even more precarious when Henri announced his intention to join a military alliance with Spain against Protestant England and the Holy Roman Empire. The proposed war would require massive financial resources that France didn't possess, and success would depend on maintaining domestic stability while French armies campaigned abroad. Catherine realized that this war represented both her greatest opportunity and her greatest danger. If Henri succeeded, he would return as a conquering hero with enhanced authority that could reduce her influence. If he failed, the resulting chaos could destroy the monarchy and leave her children vulnerable to the same fate that had nearly befallen her in Florence decades earlier. She began preparing for both possibilities simultaneously. Through her Italian connections, she arranged for additional loans that could fund the military campaign, ensuring that Henri's success would be partially attributed to her financial acumen. At the same time, she quietly strengthened her intelligence networks and began identifying potential allies who could help protect her children if the monarchy collapsed. The war that followed exceeded even Catherine's pessimistic expectations for destructive chaos. French armies won some victories, but suffered devastating defeats that drained the royal treasury and decimated the nobility. Entire noble families lost their heirs in battles that accomplished nothing beyond enriching foreign mercenaries and foreign arms dealers. As casualty reports arrived at court, Catherine found herself in the position she had been preparing for her entire adult life. Henri needed someone who could manage domestic affairs while he focused on military campaigns. The traditional male advisors were either dead on foreign battlefields or too busy with their own military obligations to provide effective counsel. Catherine stepped into the void, not as a temporary substitute for male authority, but as the person who had always been the real source of political stability in the French monarchy. She began attending council meetings, initially as Henri's representative, but gradually as a participant whose opinions carried independent weight. Nobles who had previously dismissed her as an Italian decoration found themselves seeking her favor as the person who could influence royal policy. Foreign ambassadors began requesting private audiences with Catherine, recognizing that understanding French intentions required understanding her perspectives as much as the king's. The transformation wasn't dramatic or publicly announced. Catherine simply began doing what needed to be done while Henri was distracted by military affairs. And gradually, everyone accepted that she was the person to approach when they needed decisions made or problems solved. By the time Henri returned from his campaigns, Catherine had become so integral to the functioning of the French government that removing her would have created administrative chaos. But Catherine's growing influence created new enemies among nobles who had previously ignored her as irrelevant. The Duke of Montmorency, Constable of France, and one of Henri's oldest friends, began expressing concerns about Italian influence on French policy. He pointed out that Catherine's family connections created potential conflicts of interest, that her correspondence with foreign merchants could compromise state secrets, and that her growing power violated traditional French customs about women's roles in governance. Montmorency's criticisms weren't entirely wrong, but they were strategically foolish. By openly challenging Catherine at the height of her usefulness to Henri, he forced the king to choose between his oldest friend and his most capable advisor. Henry's decision revealed just how completely Catherine had succeeded in making herself indispensable. Instead of limiting Catherine's authority to appease Montmorency's concerns, Henri publicly defended her contributions to French governance and expanded her official role in royal administration. Montmorency found himself gradually excluded from important meetings and decisions, while Catherine's influence continued to grow. Within months, the man who had tried to reduce her power was himself reduced to pleading for her favour to maintain his position at court. The lesson wasn't lost on other potential critics. Catherine had demonstrated that challenging her authority was more dangerous than accepting it, and that Henri's support for her was strong enough to cost even his oldest friends their positions if they pushed too hard. The Italian banker's daughter, who had once been dismissed as a powerless foreigner, was now someone whose displeasure could end careers and destroy families. But Catherine's greatest test was still ahead. In the summer of 1559, Henri announced plans for a grand tournament to celebrate the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, which had ended the disastrous war with Spain. The festivities would include jousting competitions, elaborate feasts, and ceremonial events designed to restore French prestige after years' conciliation. Catherine tried of military hummed to dissuade personally Henri from participating in the jousting, claiming that disturbing dreams had convinced her that the tournament would bring disaster. Her concerns weren't entirely supernatural. She understood that a king's death in what amounted to a sporting event would create a succession crisis at the worst possible moment for French stability. Henri dismissed her fears as typical feminine anxiety and Italian superstition. He was an accomplished jouster who had participated in dozens of tournaments without serious injury. The opportunity to display his martial skills before the entire court was too appealing to abandon based on his wife's nightmares. On June 30th, 1559, Henri entered the lists to face Gabriel Montgomery, captain of his Scottish Guard, in what was intended to be a routine exhibition bout between friends. What happened next would change the course of French history and transform Catherine from the power behind the throne into the power on the throne itself. Montgomery's lance struck Henri's helmet with unusual force, shattering on impact and sending splinters through the visor's opening. One piece of wood penetrated the king's eye and drove deep into his brain, while another pierced his throat. Henri fell from his horse unconscious and bleeding, his magnificent armour now a prison that trapped him in agony. For 10 days, Henri lingered between life and death, while the entire French court held its breath. Catherine maintained a constant vigil at his bedside, publicly playing the role of the devoted wife, while privately calculating the implications of every possible outcome. If Henri recovered, she would need to continue operating through his authority. If he died, she would need to protect her children's inheritance against nobles, who might see a regency as an opportunity to seize power for themselves. Henry's death on July 10th transformed Catherine overnight from Queen Consort to Queen Mother and Regent for her 15-year-old son, Francis II. But the title came with challenges that would have destroyed a less prepared ruler. The Guise family immediately moved to assert their authority over the young king, claiming that their experience in military and religious affairs made them natural advisors for a monarch who would need to deal with Protestant rebellions and foreign threats. Catherine found herself facing the same situation that had nearly destroyed her as a child in Florence. Powerful men who believed they could use a vulnerable ruler to advance their own interests. But this time, she wasn't a helpless orphan dependent on others' protection. She was a woman who had spent 30 years building networks, gathering secrets, and learning how to turn other people's ambitions into weapons. The real against themselves power, survival test of everything Catherine had learned about, and political manipulation was about to begin. France was on the verge of religious civil war. The royal treasury was empty. Foreign enemies were threatening the borders, and ambitious nobles were positioning themselves to benefit from the chaos. Most rulers would have been overwhelmed by the convergence of so many crises. Catherine had been preparing for this moment her entire adult life. The first test of Catherine's new authority came before Henry's body was even cold in his tomb. The Guise brothers arrived at the royal palace with an armed escort, ostensibly to pay their respects to the new king, but actually to establish their dominance over Francis II. They had calculated that a 15-year-old boy would be easily manipulated, and they intended to rule France through him, while Catherine faded into ceremonial irrelevance. What they hadn't anticipated was that Catherine had already moved to secure her position. While they were making grand gestures and public declarations of loyalty, she had quietly ensured that the royal household, the treasury guards, and most importantly, the king's personal attendants, were all people who owed their positions to her patronage. Francis II might be king, but he couldn't eat, dress, or leave acting with someone his chambers without inter who reported directly to his mother. The confrontation came during what should have been a routine council meeting to discuss arrangements for Henri's funeral. The Duke of Guise announced that he would be taking charge of military preparations, while his brother the Cardinal would handle diplomatic protocols. They spoke as if Catherine's consent was unnecessary, treating her as a grieving widow who would naturally defer to male authority in matters of state importance. Catherine let them finish their presentation before speaking a single word. Then, in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, she began listing the specific military units that would participate in the funeral procession, the foreign dignitaries who would be invited, and the ceremonial procedures that would be followed. Every detail had already been arranged through her networks, every decision already implemented through her loyal subordinates. The Guise brothers found themselves in the humiliating position of learning about arrangements for their own king's funeral from a woman they had intended to sideline. When Francis attempted to assert his own preferences about some minor ceremonial details, Catherine gently but firmly explained why his suggestions weren't practical, demonstrating that even the king's wishes were subject to her superior understanding of political necessities. But Catherine wasn't content to simply outmaneuver the Guise family in council meetings. She understood that real power required eliminating their ability to challenge her authority in the future. The Duke of Guise's military reputation was his greatest asset, so Catherine began systematically undermining his relationships with key army commanders. She arranged for promotions that placed her own allies in crucial positions, approved pension increases for veterans who had served loyally, and ensured that military supply contracts went to merchants who understood the benefits of maintaining good relationships with the Queen Mother. Within months, the French army's loyalty structure had been quietly reorganized around Catherine's patronage network, rather than Guise family connections. Officers who had once looked to Francis de Guise for advancement now found that their careers depended on maintaining Catherine's favour. The Duke retained his titles and ceremonial authority, but the practical power to command troops had slipped away so gradually that he barely noticed until it was too late to recover. Cardinal Charles de Guise proved more difficult to neutralize because his authority came from Rome rather than the French crown. But Catherine had spent years building relationships with Italian church officials, many of whom had connections to her birth family. Through carefully placed suggestions and strategic donations to various religious causes, she began encouraging papal authorities to question whether the cardinal's political activities were appropriate for a man of the cloth. The pressure was subtle but relentless. Church officials began expressing concerns about the cardinal's involvement planning in military. Papal nuncios started asking questions about whether his political alliance with his brother compromised his spiritual obligations. Roman authorities suggested that perhaps his energies would be better focused on purely ecclesiastical matters rather than French court intrigues. Charles de Guise found himself caught between his political ambitions and his religious career. If he ignored Rome's hints, he risked losing the church positions that provided his income and authority. If he withdrew from political involvement, he would abandon his family's campaign to control the French monarchy. Catherine had created a situation where either choice served her interests, while weakening his ability to challenge her power. Meanwhile, she was facing an entirely different kind of threat from the Protestant faction led by Louis de Bourbon, Prince of Condé. Unlike the Guise brothers, who wanted to control the monarchy, Condé and his followers were questioning whether the Valois dynasty deserved to rule France at all. Their religious convictions provided them with a moral justification for rebellion that made more dangerous than ordinary them far. Condé, her ambitious nobles, been watching Catherine's manoeuvring with growing alarm. He recognized that her consolidation of power made a Protestant victory through normal political channels increasingly unlikely. If the Huguenots were going to achieve religious freedom and political influence, they would need to act before Catherine's control became unshakable. Secret meetings began taking place in Protestant strongholds throughout France, where noble families discussed their rebellion possibility of arm against Catholic tyranny. Catherine's spy network brought her detailed reports about these gatherings, including lists of attendees, some of correspondence between areas of discussions, and copies Protestant leaders. She knew exactly how many men Condé could field, which regions would support a Protestant uprising, and most crucially, when the rebels were planning to strike. But instead of moving to crush the conspiracy immediately, Catherine made a decision that revealed the true sophistication of her political thinking. She allowed the Protestant plot to develop, while secretly manipulating its timing and targets to serve her own purposes. Through intermediaries, she fed the conspirators information that encouraged them to focus their initial attack on Guy's strongholds rather than royal positions. Her reasoning was brilliantly devious. If the Protestants succeeded in eliminating the Guise family, Catherine would be rid of her most dangerous rivals without having to take responsibility for their deaths. If the Catholics crushed the Protestant rebellion, she would have demonstrated her value as the person who warned the crown about the conspiracy while simultaneously weakening both factions through mutual destruction. The plan required precise timing and careful management of information flows. Catherine needed the Protestants to feel confident enough to act, while ensuring they weren't so well prepared that they might actually succeed in overthrowing the monarchy. She began subtly encouraging Protestant hopes by suggesting through intermediaries that the royal government might be willing to negotiate religious concessions if approached from a position of strength. At the same time, she was preparing the Catholic response by ensuring that loyal military units were positioned to respond quickly once the rebellion began. She arranged for weapon stockpiles to be moved to strategic locations, confirmed the loyalty of key fortress commanders, and established communication networks that could coordinate the government response across multiple regions simultaneously. The Protestant conspiracy finally moved into action in March 1560, with an attempt to seize the royal court at Amboise and capture the young king. The plot, known as the Conspiracy of Amboise, was exactly the kind of amateur political theatre that Catherine had been expecting. The conspirators believed their moral righteousness would compensate for their lack of military experience and strategic planning. What they discovered instead was that Catherine had been 3 moves ahead of them from the beginning. Royal forces were ready and waiting when the Protestant nobles arrived at Amboise. The rebellion collapsed within hours, with most of the conspirators either dead or captured before they could even reach the royal residence. But Catherine's masterstroke came in how she handled the aftermath of the failed rebellion. Instead of ordering mass executions that would create Protestant martyrs and inflame religious tensions, she orchestrated a carefully staged display of royal mercy. Some conspirators were executed as examples, but others received pardons that demonstrated the crown's willingness to forgive repentant subjects. Most importantly, she used the failed conspiracy to justify major changes in government structure that centralized more power in her hands. The rebellion had demonstrated that France faced serious internal threats that required strong, unified leadership. Traditional noble privileges and regional autonomies were luxuries the kingdom could no longer afford when facing enemies who would exploit any weakness. Francis II, traumatized by the attempt to kidnap him, became even more dependent on his mother's guidance. The young king had learned that the world outside the royal court was full of people who wanted to kill him, and Catherine was the only person he trusted to protect him from those dangers. What had begun as a mother's natural influence over her child was transforming into something approaching absolute authority over royal policy. The Guise brothers found their position fundamentally altered by the Amboise conspiracy. Their failure to prevent the Protestant plot had damaged their reputation as the crown's protectors, while Catherine's successful management of the crisis had enhanced her standing as the person who could navigate France through dangerous times. They remained influential, but they were no longer indispensable. Catherine had achieved something remarkable. She had used her enemies' attempts to destroy each other to eliminate threats to her own power while strengthening her control over the French government. The Protestant rebellion had failed, the Guise family had been weakened, and she had emerged as the undisputed authority behind the French throne. But her greatest challenge was yet to come. In December 1560, Francis II died suddenly after a brief illness, leaving the crown to his 10-year-old brother, Charles IX. A new regency meant new opportunities for ambitious nobles to challenge Catherine's authority, and this time, her enemies would be better prepared for the kind of political warfare she had perfected. The death of Francis II created a succession crisis that threatened to unravel everything Catherine had built. Charles IX was even younger and more vulnerable than his brother had been, making him an attractive target for nobles who believed they could manipulate a child more easily than they had managed to control Catherine. Worse, the legal basis for Catherine's regency was questionable under French law, which traditionally granted such authority to male relatives of deceased kings. Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre and senior male member of the royal family, immediately pressed his claim to serve as regent. He argued that French and custom legal precedent supported his position over that of a foreign-born woman whose authority derived solely from her role as the dead king's mother. Several prominent nobles rallied to his cause, seeing an opportunity to restore traditional male leadership to French governance. Catherine's response revealed just how completely she had mastered the art of political manipulation. Instead of fighting Antoine's legal claims directly, she began systematically destroying his credibility and undermining his support base. Through her intelligence networks, she obtained detailed information about his financial difficulties, his marital problems, and most damagingly, his secret negotiations with foreign powers who were eager to exploit French weakness. The evidence of Antoine's treasonous correspondence with Spanish agents was particularly devastating. Catherine arranged for selected documents to be discovered by loyal nobles who reported their findings to the royal council with apparent shock and dismay. The revelations transformed Antoine from a legitimate claimant to regency into a suspect loyalty traitor whose to France was questionable. But Catherine didn't simply destroy Antoine's reputation. She offered him a way to redeem himself that would serve her purposes. She suggested that his obvious talents would be better employed in military service, defending French interests against foreign enemies, rather than wasting time in domestic political disputes. The position she offered him was technically a promotion, but it would require him to leave court for extended periods, while she remained close to the young king. Antoine found himself in an impossible situation. If he refused Catherine's offer, he would appear to be putting personal ambition ahead of national service. If he accepted it, he would be voluntarily removing himself from the political arena where he might have challenged her authority. His supporters began to question whether he truly wanted the regency or was simply posturing for personal advantage. Meanwhile, Catherine was implementing the most audacious political strategy of her career. Rather than simply defending her position as regent, she began preparing to transform the regency into something approaching absolute monarchy. She understood that the weakness of child kings traditionally created opportunities for noble families to assert their independence from royal authority. Instead of accepting this pattern, she intended to use young Charles IX's vulnerability as justification for unprecedented centralization of power. Her first move was to convene the Estates General, the traditional assembly of French nobles, clergy and commoners that hadn't met for decades. Most observers assumed she was following constitutional precedent by consulting the kingdom's representatives about important policy decisions. What they didn't realize was that Catherine had spent months ensuring that the assembly would be dominated by people who owed their positions to her patronage. When the Estates General convened in January 1561, Catherine delivered a speech that redefined the relationship between the monarchy and French society. She argued that the religious conflicts tearing France apart required strong leadership that could rise above factional interests. Traditional noble privileges and regional autonomies had become obstacles to national unity that France could no longer afford. The Assembly's response exceeded even Catherine's optimistic expectations. Instead of defending their traditional rights, the representatives voted to grant her extraordinary powers to deal with the religious crisis. They authorized her to reorganize government administration, reallocate tax revenues, and take whatever measures she deemed necessary to preserve public order and royal authority. Catherine had achieved something unprecedented in French history. She had used a constitutional assembly to voluntarily surrender constitutional limitations on royal power. The nobles, clergy, and commoners had essentially voted to make her a dictator, believing they were granting temporary emergency powers to deal with a specific crisis. But Catherine had no intention of treating these powers as temporary. She immediately began using her new authority to restructure French governance around her personal control. Government departments were reorganized under administrators who reported directly to her, rather than to traditional noble officials. Tax collection was centralized under royal agents rather than regional authorities. Military commands were redistributed to ensure that army loyalty flowed through her rather than through independent noble networks. The transformation was so comprehensive that within months, the French government functioned as an extension of Catherine's will rather than a traditional monarchy constrained by custom and law. Charles IX remained king, but his authority was entirely ceremonial. Real power had been consolidated in the hands of a woman who had started her career as a powerless foreign princess, the absolute, and was now effectively ruler of France. Catherine's enemies finally began to understand what had been happening, but their realization came too late to reverse the process. She had systematically dismantled every source of independent authority that might have challenged her rule while creating new institutions that served her purposes. The nobles who had initially dismissed her as irrelevant now found themselves dependent on her favor for their continued prosperity and influence. The Guise family made one final attempt to challenge Catherine's authority by appealing directly to popular Catholic sentiment. They organized religious processions, and to show that public demonstrations design ordinary French people supported traditional Catholic leadership rather than the Italian woman who had compromised with Protestant heretics. Their campaign emphasized Catherine's foreign birth and suggested that her religious policies were weakening France's commitment to Catholic orthodoxy. Catherine's response demonstrated the ruthless efficiency that had become her trademark. Instead of trying to outcompete the Guises in displays of religious devotion, she arranged for evidence to surface suggesting that their political activities were being funded by Spanish gold. The implication was clear. The family that claimed to represent was actually serving foreign masters' French Catholic interests, who wanted to weaken French independence. The revelation destroyed whatever remained of Guy's credibility among French nobles who might have supported their challenge to Catherine's authority. Even Catholics who disagreed with her religious policies couldn't support leaders who appeared to be Spanish agents. The Guise family found themselves isolated and powerless, reduced to ceremonial positions that carried impressive titles but no real authority. By the end of 1561, Catherine had completed one of the most remarkable political transformations in European history. The orphaned Italian girl who had arrived in France as a teenage bride had become the absolute ruler of one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. She controlled the government, commanded the military, managed the treasury, and directed foreign policy with an authority that previous French kings would have envied. But Catherine's success had created new challenges that would test every skill she had developed during her rise to power. Religious warfare was spreading across France as Catholic and Protestant factions prepared for armed conflict. Foreign enemies were watching French weakness and calculating whether the time was right for invasion. The royal treasury was nearly empty after years of expensive military campaigns and lavish court spending. Most critically, Catherine's own policies were beginning to generate the very instability she had spent decades trying to control. Her religious compromises had satisfied neither Catholics nor Protestants, creating enemies on both sides who viewed her as an obstacle to their salvation. Her centralization of power had eliminated traditional checks on royal authority, but it had also made her personally responsible for every failure of French governance. The woman who had mastered the art of political survival was about to face the ultimate test of her abilities. France was sliding towards civil war, and Catherine would need to navigate between warring factions while maintaining her grip on power and protecting her children's inheritance. The skills that had brought her to the throne would now determine whether she could keep it. The stage was set for the religious wars that would define Catherine's reign and cement her reputation as either France's saviour or its destroyer. The Italian that in a princess who had learned of powerful men was to survive about to discover whether she could rule world when it descended into chaos. The first shots of what would become known as the French Wars of Religion were fired not on some grand battlefield, but in a small town called Wassy on March 1st, 1562. The Duke of Guise was travelling through the region when he encountered a group of Huguenots conducting their Sunday worship service in a barn. What happened next would plunge France into 30 years of bloodshed that would make the earlier political manoeuvring look like a children's game. According to Catholic accounts, the Protestants attacked Guise's men first. According to Protestant witnesses, Guise's soldiers massacred unarmed worshippers without provocation. The truth, as always in religious warfare, depended entirely on which side was telling the story. What mattered wasn't what actually happened, but what people believed had happened, and both sides believed they had witnessed an atrocity that demanded vengeance. Catherine received news of the Wassy massacre while holding court at Fontainebleau, surrounded by nobles who were already choosing sides for the coming conflict. She faces as reports arrived, describing bodies scattered across a barn floor, wounded Huguenots fleeing into the countryside, and Catholic soldiers claiming they had defended themselves against heretical aggression. The careful balance she had maintained between religious factions was collapsing before her eyes. But instead of panic, Catherine felt something approaching relief. The ambiguity that had made her religious policies so difficult to implement was finally ending. France would have civil war, but civil war meant she could use military necessity to justify even greater concentrations of power in her hands. A kingdom at peace might question why a foreign-born woman needed absolute authority, but a kingdom at war would accept any leader who could provide victory and stability. Her first decision revealed the calculating pragmatism that would characterize her approach to the religious wars. Rather than immediately choosing sides, Catherine declared that the crown would remain neutral while seeking to restore peace through negotiation. She announced that both Catholic and Protestant grievances had merit, that both sides had committed regrettable acts of violence, and that only royal mediation could prevent the conflict from destroying France. This position enraged extremists on both sides, who wanted the monarchy to validate their cause by condemning their enemies. Cardinal Charles de Guise accused Catherine of betraying Catholic France by refusing to punish Protestant heretics. Admiral Coligny, the Protestant military leader, charged that her neutrality was actually disguised support for Catholic oppression. Both factions began questioning whether the Valois dynasty deserved their loyalty. Catherine, this reaction had anticipated and was prepared to use it to her advantage. The religious extremists were essentially arguing that the monarchy should subordinate itself to their theological preferences, that the crown should serve the church rather than France serving the crown. By rejecting both sides' demands for partisan support, Catherine was asserting royal authority over religious authority, positioning herself as the defender of French independence against sectarian tyranny. The strategy required her to walk an impossibly narrow line between competing factions while building her own power base among moderates who feared religious warfare more than they loved theological purity. She began reaching out to nobles from both religions, who had more to lose from civil war than they had to gain from sectarian victory. These men owned lands that could be devastated by military campaigns, commanded regional economies that depended on peace and stability, and led families whose survival required avoiding the kind of factional loyalty that could prove fatal if the wrong side won. Catherine's most important convert was Michel de l'Hôpital, the Chancellor of France, and one of the most respected legal minds in the kingdom. L'Hôpital was a devout Catholic who nonetheless believed that religious uniformity was less important than political stability. He argued that France could survive theological diversity, but couldn't survive the kind of civil war that religious extremism would inevitably produce. Working together, Catherine and L'Hôpital developed what they called the Edict of January, a revolutionary document that granted limited religious toleration to French Protestants while maintaining Catholicism as the official state religion. The edict was a masterpiece of political compromise that gave both sides something they wanted, while denying both sides everything they demanded. Huguenots received the right to worship publicly in designated locations and hold religious assemblies under royal protection. Catholics retained their privileged position as the kingdom's established church and kept control of all traditional religious institutions. Neither side was entirely satisfied, but neither side had grounds to claim they were being completely suppressed. The edict's real genius lay not in its religious provisions, but in its political implications. By granting religious rights through royal decree rather than parliamentary legislation, Catherine had established the principle that the monarchy's authority extended to matters of conscience and worship. The crown could define the boundaries of acceptable religious practice, determine which beliefs deserved protection, and modify those determinations as circumstances required. But Catherine's moderation created enemies faster than it created allies. The Pope condemned the Edict of January as a betrayal of Catholic orthodoxy that legitimized heretical practices. Philip II of Spain began providing financial support to French Catholic nobles who opposed religious compromise. Protestant leaders in Germany and England started questioning whether the French Huguenots were being seduced into accepting inadequate concessions that would weaken the broader Protestant cause. Most dangerously, Catherine's policies were creating the impression that she was weak, that religious pressure could force the monarchy to change positions. Its both Catholic and Protestant extremists began calculating that increased violence might push her toward more favourable policies for their respective causes. Instead of reducing tensions, her compromise was encouraging both sides to escalate their demands. The explosion came in April 1562, When Protestant forces seized the city of Orléans and declared their intention to protect the young king from Catholic influences that were corrupting royal policy, the Prince de Condé, who had been quietly building Protestant military strength for months, announced that he was acting to preserve the legitimate monarchy against foreign manipulation by the Guise family and their Spanish allies. Catherine found herself facing exactly the situation she had been trying to avoid. Armed rebellion justified by competing claims about royal legitimacy. The Protestants argued they were defending the true king against Catholic usurpers. The Catholics responded that they were protecting France against heretical rebellion. Both sides claimed to represent royal authority while effectively rejecting royal control over their actions. Her response demonstrated the political skills that had brought her to power and the ruthless pragmatism that would keep her there. Instead of choosing between the warring factions, Catherine began playing them against each other while systematically strengthening her own independent power base. She authorized Catholic nobles to raise armies to suppress Protestant rebellion, while secretly negotiating with Protestant leaders about possible concessions that might end their revolt. The strategy required her to become, in effect, a double agent within her own government. She attended Catholic war councils where she expressed appropriate outrage about Protestant treachery, while ensuring that Catholic military plans were inefficient enough to prevent decisive victory. She maintained correspondence with Protestant leaders where she hinted at sympathy for their grievances, while gathering intelligence about their military capabilities and strategic intentions. Most importantly, Catherine began building a third faction, loyal primarily to the monarchy, rather than to any religious cause. She promoted moderate nobles to key military and administrative positions, arranged marriages that created cross-religious alliances among families that benefited from royal favour, and distributed lands and titles to reward loyalty to the crown, rather than sectarian devotion. This royalist faction became Catherine's most valuable asset as the religious wars intensified. While Catholic and Protestant armies fought each other to exhaustion, her supporters were positioning themselves to inherit power from whichever side ultimately collapsed. They controlled key fortresses, managed crucial supply lines, and commanded military units that could tip the balance in any major engagement. The first phase of the religious wars ended in March 1563 with the Battle of Dreux, a confused engagement where both sides claimed victory, while suffering casualties that left neither capable of continuing the campaign of Guise was. The Duke, assassinated by a Protestant fanatic shortly after the battle, eliminating Catherine's most dangerous Catholic rival. The Prince de Condé was captured during the fighting, removing the Protestant military leadership. Catherine seized the moment to impose a peace settlement that served her interests while appearing to address both sides' concerns. The Treaty of Amboise granted Protestants more religious rights than the previous edict, while requiring them to surrender the cities they had occupied. Catholics during the rebellion retained their dominant position in French society while accepting legal protections for Protestant worship. But the treaty's most important provisions were those that expanded royal authority over both religious communities. The Crown gained the right to license Protestant ministers, approve locations for Protestant worship, and monitor Protestant political activities. Catholic institutions were placed under increased royal supervision, with church appointments requiring government approval and ecclesiastical courts subject to royal oversight. Catherine had used the religious war to accomplish what peacetime politics had never allowed: the complete subordination of both religious communities to royal authority. Neither Catholics nor Protestants could now claim independent sources of legitimacy that might justify resistance to royal policy. Both had been forced to accept that their survival depended on maintaining the crown's favour. The young Charles IX, now 13 years old, was officially declared to have reached his majority, ending Catherine's formal regency. But the declaration was pure theatre, designed to satisfy constitutional requirements while changing nothing about the actual distribution of power. Charles remained completely dependent on his mother's guidance, and Catherine retained effective control over all government functions. The transition was managed so smoothly that most observers barely noticed it had occurred. Catherine continued attending council meetings, directing military operations, and conducting diplomatic negotiations exactly as she had during the official regency. Charles signed documents and made ceremonial appearances, but everyone understood that real authority remained in his mother's hands. Foreign ambassadors reported to their governments that France was now ruled by a woman who had proven herself more capable than most kings. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Catherine possessed a mind superior to that of a woman and a heart braver than that of a man. The Spanish envoy complained that her intelligence networks were so effective that she seemed to know Spanish policy decisions before they were officially announced in Madrid. But Catherine's success was creating new challenges that would test her abilities in ways she had never experienced. The religious peace she had imposed together by exhaust was fragile, hellion rather than genuine reconciliation. Both Catholic and Protestant leaders were using the breathing space to rebuild their military strength and prepare for the next round of fighting. Foreign powers were increasing their involvement in French affairs, viewing the kingdom's religious divisions as opportunities to advance their own strategic interests. Most troubling, Catherine's own family was beginning to fracture along religious lines. Her daughter Elizabeth, now through her marriage to Philip, Queen of Spain II, was pressuring her mother to adopt more aggressive anti-Protestant policies. Her son-in-law was providing financial support to French Catholic nobles who opposed Catherine's religious compromise. The woman who had spent decades building alliances was discovering that family loyalty couldn't always overcome ideology. The problemological conviction acute with her was Most's second son, Henri, Duke of Anjou, who was emerging as a leader of the ultra-Catholic faction at court. Henri possessed genuine military talent and had inherited his mother's political instincts, but he was using those gifts to build an independent power base that could potentially challenge Catherine's authority. At only 13 years old, he was already attracting followers who saw him as a more reliable defender of Catholic orthodoxy than his moderate mother. Catherine faced a dilemma that would have destroyed a less experienced political operator. She needed to maintain Henry's loyalty and harness his abilities for royal service, but she couldn't allow him to become the focal point for Catholic opposition to her policies. The solution required her to perform perhaps the most delicate manipulation of her career, encouraging her son's ambitions while ensuring they served her purposes rather than undermining them. She began by giving Henri increased responsibilities in military affairs, allowing him to command Catholic forces in operations against Protestant strongholds, while ensuring that his strategic objectives aligned with broader royal policy. Henri gained valuable experience and enhanced his reputation among Catholic nobles, but his successes strengthened royal authority rather than creating an independent power base. Simultaneously, Catherine was working to prevent Protestant leaders from rebuilding their military capabilities to the point where they could threaten royal control. She used her intelligence networks to monitor Protestant communications, identifying potential troublemakers before they could organize effective resistance. When necessary, she arranged for key Protestant leaders to receive lucrative appointments that required them to leave their regional power bases and take up residence at court, where they could be more easily supervised. The balance Catherine maintained between competing factions was so complex that she was essentially running multiple governments simultaneously. Catholic nobles believed she was secretly working to advance their interests, while appearing to compromise with Protestant demands. Protestant leaders thought she was protecting them from Catholic extremism, while seeming to support traditional religious policies. Foreign ambassadors reported conflicting assessments of French policy, because Catherine was telling each of them what they wanted to hear while revealing nothing about her actual intentions. The system worked because Catherine had learned to compartmentalize information and relationships in ways that prevented any single faction from understanding the full scope of her activities. Each group knew only what they needed to know to serve her purposes, and none of them had access to enough information to recognize how completely they were being manipulated. But the religious peace Catherine had constructed was about to face its greatest test. In 1567, reports reached Paris that Spanish armies were marching through the Low Countries to suppress Protestant rebellion in the Netherlands. The news sent shock waves through French Protestant communities who feared that Philip II was preparing to extend his religious campaign into France. Catholic nobles, meanwhile, saw an opportunity to align French policy with Spanish interests and finally eliminate Protestant heresy from the kingdom. The crisis would force Catherine to choose between the religious neutrality that had served her so well and the kind of decisive action that could either save her kingdom or destroy everything she had built. The woman who had spent her career avoiding final commitments was about to discover that situations some required her to reveal her true loyalties, regardless of the consequences. As reports of Spanish military movements continued to arrive at the French court, Catherine realized that the careful balance she had maintained between religious factions was about to collapse. The mere possibility of Spanish intervention in French affairs was transforming domestic religious tensions into questions of national survival. Both Catholic and Protestant leaders were demanding that she choose sides, arguing that neutrality in the face of foreign threat was itself a form of treason. The Spanish threat forced Catherine into the most dangerous gamble of her political career. She understood that any response to Philip II's military buildup would alienate half of France while potentially provoking a foreign invasion that could destroy the monarchy entirely. But inaction was equally perilous, as both religious factions were interpreting her silence as evidence that she had already chosen their enemy's side. Catherine's solution revealed the strategic brilliance that had carried her from powerless orphan to absolute ruler. Instead of responding to Spanish movements directly, she began orchestrating a series of seemingly unrelated events that would force her enemies to reveal their true intentions, while providing her with justification for whatever actions she ultimately chose to take. Her first move targeted the Protestant leadership through one of the most audacious deceptions of her career. Catherine arranged for Admiral Coligny, the most respected Protestant military commander, to receive intelligence suggesting that Spanish gold was financing Catholic plots against his life. The information was accurate enough to be believable, but incomplete enough to encourage Coligny to take actions that would serve Catherine's purposes, rather than his own interests. Coligny responded exactly as Catherine had anticipated. Believing himself to be the target of an imminent assassination attempt, he began consolidating Protestant forces around his own strongholds while reaching out to Protestant allies in Germany and England for military support. His preparations were defensive in nature, but they appeared threatening to Catholic observers who interpreted any Protestant military activity as preparation for renewed rebellion. Meanwhile, Catherine was feeding carefully selected information to Catholic leaders, suggesting that Protestant military preparations were more extensive than they actually were. She provided the Duke of Alba, Philip II's commander in the Netherlands, with intelligence reports that exaggerated Protestant strength while understating Catholic capabilities. Her goal was to encourage Spanish intervention that would be large enough to threaten French independence, but not so overwhelming that it could actually succeed in conquering the kingdom. The strategy required Catherine to perform perhaps the most complex manipulation of her career, simultaneously encouraging both sides to take actions that neither fully understood while positioning herself to benefit, regardless of the outcome. If Spanish forces invaded France, she could unite the kingdom against foreign aggression while eliminating domestic rivals who had collaborated with the enemy. If diplomatic pressure convinced Philip II to withdraw, she could claim credit for protecting French independence through skillful negotiation. But Catherine's machinations were interrupted by an event that threatened to destroy everything she had built. On September 28, 1567, Protestant forces launched a surprise attack designed to capture Charles IX and remove him from his mother's influence. The conspiracy, known as the Surprise of Meaux, came closer to success than any previous challenge to Catherine's authority. The Protestant plan was elegantly simple. They would seize the king during a hunting expedition, transport him to a Protestant stronghold, and announce that they were protecting him from Catholic advisors who had corrupted royal policy through foreign influence. With Charles IX under their control, they could issuations that legitimate royal proclamized Protestant political demands, while portraying Catherine as a usurper who had exceeded her proper authority. Catherine learned of the plot only hours before it was scheduled to begin, when one of her spies within the Protestant leadership managed to get word to her through the intelligence network she had spent decades constructing. The warning came so late that conventional defensive measures were impossible. The royal court was scattered across the countryside on various hunting expeditions. The Swiss Guard was divided among multiple locations, and most of Catherine's reliable military commanders were too far away to provide immediate assistance. Faced with the imminent capture of her son and the collapse of her government, Catherine made a decision that revealed both her courage and her desperation. Instead of attempting to flee or negotiate with the conspirators, she chose to confront them directly through a display of royal authority that would either cow them into submission or provide a dramatic finale to her political career. Catherine ordered the immediate recall of all courtiers and guards to the royal hunting lodge where Charles IX was staying. She had the building's defences strengthened as much as possible given the limited time available, and she prepared to make a stand that would determine the future of the French monarchy. Most remarkably, she decided to use Charles IX himself as her primary weapon against the Protestant conspiracy. The young king had spent his entire reign as a ceremonial figurehead, whose authority was exercised by his mother. But Catherine understood that the conspirators' plan depended on portraying Charles as a victim of maternal tyranny who would welcome liberation by his Protestant subjects. She needed to demonstrate that the king supported her policies willingly, that he viewed the Protestant attack as treason rather than rescue. When Protestant forces surrounded the hunting lodge on September 30th, they found Catherine and Charles IX standing together on the building's main balcony, visible to all the assembled conspirators. Catherine had dressed her son in full royal regalia and positioned him to deliver a speech that she had carefully prepared for maximum psychological impact. Charles IX's words carried across the courtyard with an authority that surprised everyone present, including Catherine herself. He denounced the Protestant conspiracy as an act of rebellion against the rightful monarchy, declared that he ruled France according to his own judgment rather than foreign influence, and commanded the conspirators to disperse immediately or face charges of treason. Most importantly, he made it clear that he viewed any attack on his mother as an attack on royal authority itself. The speech transformed what had been planned as a rescue operation into an obvious act of rebellion against a king who was clearly supporting his mother's policies. The Protestant conspirators found themselves in an impossible position. They had justified their actions as protecting royal authority, but the king himself was rejecting their protection and condemning their proceed with their plan would require methods. To them, to openly admit that they were rebelling against the monarchy rather than defending it. Most of the Protestant nobles began withdrawing from the conspiracy as soon as Charles IX finished speaking. They had been willing to participate in what they believed was a legitimate effort to protect the king from harmful influences, but they weren't prepared to commit open treason against a monarch who was clearly acting according to his own will. Within hours, the formidable force that had surrounded the hunting lodge had melted away, leaving only a handful of die-hard extremists who were quickly captured by royal guards. Catherine had achieved something unprecedented in the history of royal regencies. She had used a child king's authority to defend her own power against conspirators who thought they could exploit that same child's weakness. The incident demonstrated that Charles IX supported his mother willingly, that attempts to separate them would be viewed as attacks on royal legitimacy itself. But Catherine's victory at Meaux came with cost that would influence the remainder of her reign. The Protestant leadership had been humiliated by the failure of their conspiracy, and humiliated enemies were more dangerous than defeated ones. Admiral Coligny and his supporters began planning a more comprehensive campaign that would eliminate Catherine's power permanently rather than simply reducing it. More troubling, The Meaux incident had forced Catherine to rely on Charles IX's public support in ways that gave the young king more real authority than she had previously allowed him to exercise. Having used his genuine royal authority to defend her position, she could no longer treat him as a purely ceremonial figurehead, without risking the appearance of hypocrisy that might encourage future conspiracies. Charles IX had tasted real power during the crisis, and he showed signs of wanting more control over royal policy than his mother was comfortable granting. At 16, he was old enough to understand the political implications of his actions, and young enough to resent the limitations that Catherine continued to place on his authority. The relationship that had been the foundation of Catherine's power was beginning to evolve in ways that could ultimately threaten that power. The Spanish situation was also deteriorating in directions that limited Catherine's options. Philip II had interpreted the Meaux conspiracy as evidence that French Protestants were too dangerous to be tolerated, and he was increasing pressure on Catherine to adopt more aggressive anti-Protestant policies. Spanish gold was flowing to French Catholic nobles who were positioning themselves as more reliable defenders of Orthodox Christianity than the compromising Queen Mother. Foreign Protestant powers were simultaneously increasing their support for French Huguenot leaders who argued that Catherine's moderation was actually a form of disguised persecution. English agents were providing weapons and financial support to Protestant strongholds, while German Protestant princes were offering military assistance to their French co-religionists. Catherine's domestic religious conflict was becoming internationalized in ways that reduced her ability to control events through purely French political maneuvering. The woman who had built her career on maintaining balance between competing factions was discovering that external pressures were making such balance increasingly impossible to sustain. Both sides were receiving foreign encouragement to adopt more extreme positions, while foreign powers were viewing French religious divisions as opportunities to advance their own strategic interests at French expense. Catherine's response to these mounting pressures revealed both her continued political sophistication and her growing desperation. She began preparing for what she privately acknowledged might be the final phase of her political career. If she couldn't maintain peace between French religious factions, she would need to choose a side and win decisively enough to eliminate her enemies permanently. The choice she ultimately made would define her historical reputation and determine whether France emerged from it as a unified Catholic religious wars kingdom, a tolerant multi-religious state, or a devastated battleground where foreign powers had carved up French territory among themselves. Everything Catherine had built during 3 decades of political maneuvering was about to be tested in the crucible of total warfare. The decision came in August 1568, when Catherine received intelligence that Protestant forces were planning a coordinated uprising that would simultaneously target royal strongholds throughout France. Unlike previous Protestant conspiracies that had focused on limited political objectives, this campaign was designed to overthrow the Valois monarchy entirely and establish a Protestant republic modelled on the Dutch rebellion against Spanish rule. Catherine understood that this was the moment she had been preparing for since her childhood imprisonment in Florence. The skills she had developed, the network she had built, and the authority she had accumulated would now be tested against enemies who were no longer interested in compromise or coexistence. The woman who had survived by avoiding final commitments was about to make the most final commitment of her life. Her response would earn her the nickname that would follow her through history, transforming her from Catherine de' Medici, the political survivor, into Catherine de' Medici, the Poison Queen. But that transformation would come at a cost that would haunt her for the remainder of her days, as the methods that preserved her power would also ensure that power was forever stained with blood. The religious wars that had begun with skirmishes between competing factions were about to escalate into something approaching genocide, and Catherine would stand at the centre of the carnage as both its architect and its most prominent victim. The Italian princess, who had learned to survive in a world of powerful men, was about to discover what happened when survival required her to become more ruthless than any of them had ever dared to be. The intelligence reports that reached Catherine in the summer of 1568 painted a picture of coordinated Protestant rebellion that dwarfed all previous challenges to royal authority. Huguenot leaders had spent months stockpiling weapons, fortifying strategic positions, and establishing communication networks that could coordinate simultaneous uprisings across multiple regions of France. Most alarming, they had secured promises of military support from Protestant powers in Germany and England that could provide them with professional soldiers and modern artillery. Catherine realised that traditional political manoeuvring would be inadequate to meet this threat. The Protestant conspiracy was too well organised to be disrupted through the kind of selective arrests and strategic bribes that had neutralised previous challenges. The scale of foreign involvement meant that defeating the rebellion would require military campaigns that could drain the royal treasury and devastate French territory. Most critically, the Protestant leadership had learned from their previous failures and were no longer vulnerable to the psychological warfare that Catherine had used so effectively in the past. Her response began with a decision that revealed how completely she had abandoned the religious neutrality that had defined her earlier policies. Catherine announced that the Crown would no longer tolerate Protestant worship anywhere in France, that all Huguenot ministers must leave the kingdom within 15 days, and that any Protestant who refused to convert to Catholicism would forfeit their property and citizenship. The Edict of Saint-Maur, as this proclamation became known, represented a complete reversal of the religious compromise that Catherine had spent years constructing. The edict was designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. By adopting an uncompromisingly Catholic position, Catherine neutralised Catholic criticism of her previous moderation, while gaining access to the financial and military resources that zealous Catholics were willing to provide for religious warfare. The harsh terms offered to Protestants were intended to encourage mass emigration that would reduce the domestic threat while demonstrating royal determination to foreign observers. Most importantly, the edict forced moderate Protestants to choose between their religious convictions and their loyalty to France. Catherine calculated that many Huguenots would abandon their co-religionists rather than face exile and financial ruin, weakening Protestant military strength while providing her with intelligence about remaining conspirators who chose to resist rather than comply. The Protestant response exceeded even Catherine's pessimistic expectations for destructive violence. Rather than submitting to royal authority or fleeing into exile, Huguenot leaders declared that the Edict of Saint-Maur had released them from all obligations to obey an illegitimate monarchy that had betrayed its sacred duty to protect all French subjects regardless of their religious beliefs. Admiral Coligny announced that Protestant forces would fight to establish a new form of government that would guarantee religious freedom and constitutional limits on royal power. What followed was the most brutal phase of the French religious wars, a conflict that would make previous political violence look restrained by comparison. Both sides abandoned any pretense of fighting to reform the existing system and began campaigns designed to eliminate their enemies entirely. Villages suspected of harbouring religious dissidents were burned to the ground with their inhabitants still inside. Prisoners were tortured to reveal information about their allies' activities before being executed in ways designed to terrorise surviving supporters. Catherine found herself presiding over a kingdom that was rapidly descending into barbarism, but she had passed the point where retreat was possible. The Protestant rebellion had to be crushed completely, or her own survival and that of her children would be impossible. She began authorizing military measures that she would never have contemplated during peacetime, including the systematic destruction of Protestant strongholds and the execution of captured Huguenot leaders without trial. The transformation in Catherine's methods was most visible in her treatment of prisoners taken during the siege of La Rochelle, the most important Protestant fortress in western France. Previous military campaigns had generally respected traditional rules of warfare that protected non-combatants and allowed defeated enemies to surrender with honor. Catherine's forces at La Rochelle received orders to show no mercy to anyone found within the city walls, regardless of their age, gender, or level of involvement in the rebellion. The massacre that followed would have shocked observers who remembered Catherine's earlier reputation for political moderation and diplomatic sophistication. Thousands of Protestant civilians were killed during the capture of La Rochelle, their bodies left unburied as a warning to other communities that might consider supporting Huguenot resistance. Catherine justified the brutality as necessary to end the rebellion quickly, arguing that temporary harshness would prevent prolonged suffering by deterring further resistance. But the strategy of terror was producing results that even Catherine hadn't anticipated. Protestant communities throughout France were indeed abandoning their resistance, but they were also fleeing the kingdom in numbers that threatened to depopulate entire regions. Skilled craftsmen, successful merchants, and educated professionals were emigrating to Protestant countries where their talents could be employed without fear of persecution. The economic disruption was devastating French commerce and reducing tax revenues at precisely the moment when the crown needed maximum resources for military campaigns. More troubling, Catherine's harsh anti-Protestant policies were creating new enemies among previously loyal Catholics who were disturbed by the scale of violence being employed in religion's name. Moderate Catholic nobles began questioning whether the cure for Protestant rebellion might be worse than the disease, whether a kingdom maintained through mass executions and forced conversions could claim to represent Christian values. The most prominent critic of Catherine's methods was Michel de l'Hôpital, the same chancellor who had helped her develop earlier policies of religious compromise. L'Hôpital argued that the crown was destroying the moral authority that legitimized royal rule, that subjects would never willingly obey a monarchy that had proven itself capable of such systematic cruelty. He warned that the methods being used against Protestants could eventually be employed against any group that displeased royal authority, making all French subjects potential victims of government terror. Catherine's response to L'Hôpital's criticism revealed how completely the religious wars had changed her political calculations. Instead of engaging with his arguments or seeking compromise positions that might address his concerns, she simply removed him from his position and replaced him with administrators who would implement her policies without philosophical objections. The woman who had built her career through careful coalition building was now governing through fear and force rather than persuasion and manipulation. The change in Catherine's methods reflected her growing understanding that the religious conflict had fundamentally altered the nature of French politics. The careful balance between competing factions that had served her so well during peacetime was impossible to maintain when those factions were committed to each other's total destruction. She could no longer survive by playing all sides because there were no longer multiple sides willing to accept her mediation. Charles IX was also changing in ways that complicated Catherine's position. The young king had initially supported his mother's harsh anti-Protestant policies, but he was becoming disturbed by their practical consequences. At 19, he was old enough to understand that the methods being employed in his name would define his historical reputation, and he was beginning to question whether the political benefits justified the moral costs. The tension between Catherine and Charles IX came to a head during discussions about how to handle Protestant leaders who had been captured during recent military campaigns. Catherine advocated for immediate execution without trial, arguing that public trials would provide platforms for Protestant propaganda, while delayed punishment would encourage other rebels to believe they might escape consequences for their actions. Charles IX, however, was influenced by advisors who argued that legitimate monarchs governed through law rather than arbitrary force, that executing prisoners without proper legal proceedings would establish precedents that could ultimately threaten royal authority itself. He began insisting on formal trials that would provide at least the appearance of legal justice, even if the outcomes were predetermined. The disagreement represented more than a tactical dispute about prisoner treatment. Catherine and Charles IX were operating according to fundamentally different theories about the source of royal authority and the proper relationship between monarchy and law. Catherine believed that survival justified any methods necessary to maintain power, while Charles IX was beginning to think that power maintained through illegitimate means would ultimately prove unsustainable. Their conflict was resolved through a compromise that satisfied neither of them completely, but allowed both to claim victory. Protestant leaders would receive formal trials, but the proceedings would be conducted by specially appointed judges who understood the political necessity of reaching appropriate verdicts. The appearance of legal process would be maintained while ensuring that the practical results served Catherine's strategic objectives. But the compromise created new problems by establishing the principle that Charles IX's authority could limit Catherine's freedom of action. The young king had successfully challenged his mother's policies and forced modifications that reflected his preferences rather than hers. Other courtiers began to wonder whether Charles IX might be prepared to assert greater independence from maternal guidance, whether the regency that had never formally ended might finally be drawing to a close. Catherine recognized the danger and began taking steps to ensure that Charles IX's growing independence would serve her interests rather than threatening them. She arranged for the king to receive military commands that would enhance his reputation while requiring him to implement policies she had designed. She encouraged him to take public credit for successful operations while ensuring that the planning and execution remained under her control. Most importantly, Catherine began positioning herself as Charles IX's indispensable advisor rather than his superior. Instead of issuing direct orders, she provided recommendations that the king could accept or reject according to his judgment. Instead of making policy announcements herself, she convinced Charles IX to make declarations that reflected her strategic thinking, while appearing to represent his independent decisions. The transformation was subtle but significant. Catherine was evolving from a regent who ruled through a child king to a counselor who influenced an adult monarch. The change preserved her practical authority while acknowledging Charles IX's constitutional position, creating a new form of shared governance that could accommodate the king's desire for respect without threatening Catherine's control over policy. But this delicate arrangement was about to face its ultimate test. Intelligence reports were reaching the French court describing a massive Protestant conspiracy that would dwarf all previous challenges to royal authority. Foreign Protestant powers were preparing to provide military support on a scale that could transform the French religious conflict into a general European war. Catherine would need to make decisions about war and peace that would determine not only her own fate, but the survival of the French monarchy itself. The woman who had spent her career avoiding irreversible commitments was about to face choices that would define her historical legacy and determine whether France emerged from its religious crisis as a unified kingdom or a collection of foreign-controlled territories. Everything she had learned about political survival would be tested against enemies who were no longer interested in coexistence or compromise. The stage was set for the most controversial decision of Catherine's career, a choice that would transform her from a respected political survivor into one of history's most notorious figures. The methods that had brought her to power would now be used in service of an action so shocking that it would overshadow everything else she had accomplished, ensuring that future generations would remember her not as a skilled ruler who had preserved France during a time of crisis, but as the architect of one of the most infamous massacres in European history. The intelligence that reached Catherine in the autumn of 1571 was more alarming than anything 3 decades of political warfare she had encountered during. Admiral Coligny, the Protestant military leader who had survived multiple assassination attempts, was no longer content with defending Huguenot strongholds or negotiating religious concessions. He had developed an audacious plan that would transform France's religious conflict into a European war that could destroy the Valois monarchy entirely. Coligny's strategy was brilliantly conceived and terrifyingly ambitious. He intended to convince Charles IX to declare war on Spain, ostensibly to support Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, but actually to unite French Catholics and Protestants against a common foreign enemy. Once French armies were committed to fighting Philip II, Coligny calculated that military necessity would force the Crown to arm Protestant militia units and grant them the political concessions they had been unable to achieve through domestic rebellion. Catherine understood immediately that Coligny's plan represented the most sophisticated threat she had ever faced. Unlike previous Protestant conspiracies that had relied on military force or foreign intervention, this strategy would use Charles IX's own authority to advance Protestant interests while making resistance appear treasonous. The king would become an unwitting instrument of Huguenot political objectives while believing he was pursuing legitimate royal policy. The danger was magnified by Charles IX's growing fascination with military glory and his increasing resentment of his reputation as a weak king dominated by his mother. Coligny had positioned himself as a mentor who could guide the young monarch toward the kind of martial achievements that would establish his historical legacy. The admiral spoke eloquently about the honour that would come from liberating oppressed Protestants while expanding French territory at Spanish expense. Catherine watched with growing alarm as Charles IX began adopting Coligny's strategic thinking and seeking the admiral's advice on matters that had previously been reserved for family consultation. The king started referring to Coligny as his most trusted counsellor, praising his wisdom and experience in ways that implicitly criticised Catherine's more cautious approach to foreign affairs. Court observers noted that Charles IX seemed more animated and confident during conversations with Coligny than he had ever appeared during meetings with his mother. The relationship between Charles IX and Admiral Coligny represented everything Catherine had spent her career trying to prevent. A powerful noble had gained independent access to royal authority and was using that access to pursue policies that could destroy the monarchy while claiming to serve its interests. Worse, the king himself was enthusiastically supporting these policies, making it impossible for Catherine to oppose them through traditional methods of maternal influence. Catherine's initial response demonstrated the political sophistication that had carried her through previous crises. Instead of openly challenging Coligny's influence, she began working to isolate him from other Protestant leaders who might have moderated his ambitions. Through carefully placed agents, she spread rumours suggesting that the admiral was pursuing personal glory at the expense of genuine Protestant interests, that his war plans would sacrifice Huguenot lives for military objectives that served French rather than religious goals. Simultaneously, Catherine was building support among Catholic nobles who were alarmed by the prospect of war with Spain. She reminded them that previous conflicts with Philip II had devastated French finances and decimated the nobility without producing lasting territorial gains. She pointed out that Coligny's strategy would require arming Protestant militia units that could easily be turned against Catholic communities once the foreign war ended. But Catherine's most effective weapon against Coligny was information. Her intelligence networks had provided her with detailed knowledge of his correspondence with foreign Protestant leaders, his financial dealings with Dutch rebels, and his private of French governance conversations about the future. She understood his strategic thinking better than his own supporters did, and she was prepared to use that knowledge to destroy him when the moment was right. The confrontation came during a royal council meeting in June 1572, when Coligny formally presented his proposal for war against Spain to Charles IX and the assembled nobles. The admiral's presentation was masterful, combining appeals to royal honour with practical arguments about French strategic interests. He argued that Spain was already France's enemy through its support for Catholic extremists, that war was inevitable regardless of French preferences, and that attacking first would provide crucial advantages in timing and positioning. Charles IX was visibly excited by Coligny's proposal, interrupting the presentation with enthusiastic questions about military tactics and territorial objectives. The young king seemed to view the proposed war as an opportunity to prove himself worthy of comparison with France's greatest warrior kings, to establish his own legacy, independent of his mother's political achievements. Catherine, allowed Coligny to complete his presentation before responding, using the silence to gauge the reactions of other council members and calculate the most effective approach to destroying debility. When his Quréshi finally spoke, her words carried the authority of someone who had navigated European politics for 3 decades while Coligny had been fighting regional skirmishes. She began by praising the admiral's military expertise and acknowledging the logical appeal of his strategic analysis. Then, with devastating precision, she began revealing information that transformed his proposal from a brilliant strategy into evidence of treasonous collaboration with foreign enemies. Catherine produced copies of Coligny's correspondence with Dutch rebels, demonstrating that his war plans had been developed in consultation with Spain's enemies rather than France's interests. More damaging, she revealed that Coligny had promised Dutch leaders that French Protestant forces would remain in the Netherlands after Spain's defeat, effectively ceding French territory to foreign Protestant control. The Admiral's plan wasn't designed to expand French power, but to advance an international Protestant alliance that would subordinate French interests to religious solidarity. The revelation transformed the council meeting's atmosphere from enthusiastic support for foreign adventure to shocked recognition of Protestant treachery. Catholic nobles who had been wavering in their opposition to Coligny's proposal now understood that they were facing something far more dangerous than military miscalculation. The Admiral wasn't simply advocating for risky foreign policy, he was actively working to subordinate French sovereignty to Protestant international objectives. Charles IX's reaction revealed both his political naivety and his fundamental loyalty to French interests over religious considerations. The young king had been seduced by visions of military glory, but he wasn't prepared to sacrifice French independence for Protestant solidarity. When confronted with evidence of Coligny's divided loyalties, Charles IX felt personally betrayed by someone he had trusted as a mentor and advisor. But Catherine wasn't content to simply discredit Coligny through revelation of his correspondence with foreign powers. She understood that the Admiral's influence over Charles IX represented a broader threat that required more comprehensive solutions. Protestant leaders throughout France were watching to see whether their most prominent representative could successfully manipulate royal policy, and Catherine needed to demonstrate that such manipulation would produce consequences severe enough to deter future attempts. Her solution was characteristically sophisticated and utterly ruthless. Instead of directly ordering Coligny's arrest or execution, which would make her appear to be the primary mover behind his downfall, Catherine began orchestrating a series of events that would make his destruction appear to be the natural consequence of his own actions, rather than the result of her machinations. The first element of her plan involved encouraging Charles IX to demand explanations for Coligny's foreign correspondence that the Admiral couldn't provide without admitting his treasonous intentions. Catherine suggested that the king should give Coligny opportunities to clarify his position, knowing that any honest explanation would confirm his guilt, while any dishonest response would provide grounds for charges of perjury and contempt. Coligny found himself trapped in exactly the kind of impossible situation that Catherine had been creating for her enemies throughout her career. He couldn't admit that he had been coordinating French policy with foreign Protestant leaders without confirming charges of treason. He couldn't deny the correspondence without being caught in obvious lies that would destroy his credibility with Charles IX. Any response he gave would either condemn him legally or discredit him politically. The Admiral chose to maintain his innocence while providing explanations that satisfied no one and convinced Charles IX that he had been systematically deceived by someone he had trusted. Coligny claimed that his correspondence with Dutch rebels was purely informational, that he had made no commitments that would compromise French sovereignty, and that his war proposals were designed solely to advance French interests. But the documented evidence contradicted every aspect of his defense. Catherine watched with satisfaction as Charles IX's admiration for Coligny transformed into the kind of personal hatred that young men feel when they discover that respected mentors have been manipulating them for selfish purposes. The king began referring to the Admiral as a traitor who had exploited royal trust for foreign objectives, and he started demanding punishments severe enough to deter other nobles from similar betrayals. But Catherine's masterstroke was yet to come. She understood that simply destroying Coligny would eliminate one threat while leaving the broader Protestant leadership structure intact. Other Huguenot nobles would learn from the admiral's mistakes and develop more sophisticated approaches to influencing royal policy. Catherine needed to create a solution that would eliminate the Protestant political threat permanently, while appearing to be a spontaneous response to immediate circumstances rather than a calculated campaign of extermination. The opportunity she had been waiting for arrived in August 1572, when Protestant nobles from throughout France gathered in Paris to celebrate the wedding of Catherine's daughter Marguerite to Henri de Bourbon, King of Navarre. The marriage was itself a masterpiece of political manipulation, designed to demonstrate royal commitment to religious reconciliation while bringing Protestant leaders into a situation where they could be monitored and controlled. Catherine had spent months planning every aspect of the wedding celebration, but her most important preparations were invisible to the guests who arrived in Paris expecting to participate in a joyous demonstration of religious unity. She had positioned loyal military units throughout the city, established communication networks that could coordinate simultaneous actions across multiple locations, and identified the specific Protestant leaders whose elimination would decapitate Huguenot political organization. The wedding festivities proceeded exactly as Catherine had planned, with Catholic and Protestant nobles mingling in apparent harmony, while she observed their interactions and confirmed the intelligence assessments that would guide her final move against Protestant political power. Admiral Coligny attended the celebration despite the tensions that had developed between him and the royal family, believing that his presence would demonstrate his continued loyalty to French interests. On August 18th, 4 days after the wedding ceremony, Coligny was shot while walking through Paris by an assassin whose identity remains disputed to this day. The attack wounded the admiral severely but failed to kill him, creating exactly the kind of crisis situation that Catherine had been preparing to exploit. Protestant nobles immediately assumed that the assassination attempt had been ordered by the royal family, while Catholics feared that Protestant retaliation would plunge Paris into street warfare. Catherine's response to the attempted assassination revealed the full scope of the plan she had been developing for months. Instead of investigating the attack or attempting to calm tensions between religious factions, she used the crisis as justification for actions that she presented as necessary for public safety, but were actually designed to eliminate Protestant political leadership permanently. She convinced Charles IX that the assassination attempt was part of a broader Protestant conspiracy to seize control of Paris and kidnap the royal family. The evidence she provided was convincing enough to justify emergency measures, but vague enough to allow those measures to be interpreted as broadly as circumstances required. Most importantly, she persuaded the king that immediate action was necessary to prevent Protestant forces from coordinating a response that could threaten royal authority. The orders that went out from the royal palace on the night of August 23rd were carefully crafted to appear defensive while actually implementing an offensive strategy that Catherine had been planning since Coligny's influence over Charles IX had become apparent. Royal guards received instructions to protect the monarchy against Protestant treachery, with specific lists of nobles who posed immediate threats to public safety and needed to be detained for questioning. What followed would become known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, an event that would transform Catherine from a respected political survivor into one of history's most controversial figures. But the massacre wasn't a spontaneous explosion of religious hatred, as it would later be portrayed by historians seeking to minimize royal responsibility. It was the culmination of months of careful planning by a woman who had decided that her survival required the permanent elimination of enemies, who could no longer be controlled through traditional political methods. The killing began before dawn on August 24th with the systematic assassination of Protestant leaders who had been identified as the most dangerous threats to royal authority. Admiral Coligny, still recovering from his wounds, was murdered in his bed by royal guards who claimed to be protecting him from Catholic mobs. Henri de Bourbon barely escaped death by agreeing to convert to Catholicism, a decision that saved his life but destroyed his credibility with Protestant supporters. But the massacre quickly expanded beyond its original targets, as Catholic crowds throughout Paris began attacking Protestant neighbours, with encouragement from royal officials, who claimed to be acting on direct orders from Charles IX. What had begun as a carefully planned elimination of specific political threats transformed into a general slaughter that claimed thousands of lives and spread to Protestant communities throughout France. Catherine watched the violence unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and horror. She had achieved her primary objective of eliminating Protestant political leadership, but the scale of killing had exceeded even her expectations for comprehensive solutions. The massacre was serving her strategic purposes, but it was also creating a legacy of bloodshed that would haunt her reputation for centuries to come. Charles IX's reaction to the massacre revealed both his complicity in Catherine's planning and his shock at the practical consequences of their decisions. The young king had approved the elimination of Protestant leaders who threatened royal authority, but he hadn't anticipated that royal guards would interpret their orders as permission for indiscriminate killing. He found himself responsible for atrocities that exceeded anything he had intended to authorize. The psychological impact on Charles IX was devastating. The king who had dreamed of military glory found himself associated with what amounted to mass murder of defenseless civilians. He began suffering from nightmares and physical symptoms that suggested profound guilt about his role in the massacre. Catherine realized that her son's mental state was becoming a potential threat to the political benefits she had gained through the elimination of Protestant leadership. Foreign reaction to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was swift and universally condemnatory. Protestant powers throughout Europe began treating France as a pariah state whose government couldn't be trusted to honor international agreements or protect foreign nationals. Philip II of Spain publicly praised Catherine's actions while privately calculating how Spanish interests could benefit from France's international isolation. Most damaging to Catherine's long-term position, the massacre had eliminated Protestant political leadership without eliminating Protestant religious conviction. Surviving Huguenots were more committed than ever to resistance against a monarchy that had proven itself capable of systematic extermination. Instead of ending the religious wars, the massacre had transformed them into a conflict between Catholics loyal to the crown and Protestants who viewed the royal family as illegitimate usurpers. The woman who had spent her career building coalitions and managing competing interests found herself ruling a kingdom divided into irreconcilable camps. She had achieved the kind of decisive victory that had always eluded her. But victory had come at the cost of the moral authority that had legitimized her power. Catherine was now France's undisputed ruler, but she was ruling through fear rather than consent, and fear was a more fragile foundation for authority than the careful political relationships she had cultivated throughout her earlier career. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre marked the end of Catherine's evolution from powerless orphan to absolute ruler. She had demonstrated that she possessed the ruthlessness necessary to eliminate any threat to her authority. But she had also revealed that such ruthlessness came with consequences that would define the remainder of her reign. The methods that had preserved her power had also ensured that power would forever be associated with one of the most infamous episodes in French history. Catherine de Medici had survived every challenge that Renaissance politics could present, had outmaneuvered every enemy who had threatened her position, and had built a form of royal authority that exceeded anything achieved by her predecessors. But survival had required her to become something that even her enemies hadn't expected: a ruler whose name would be synonymous with political murder for centuries to come. The Poison Queen of France had earned her title not through exotic toxins or mysterious deaths, but through the systematic elimination of political opposition using methods that were far more brutal than any individual assassination. Catherine had poisoned French politics itself, introducing a level of systematic violence that would influence royal governance long after her own death. The Italian princess who had arrived in France as a frightened teenager had become something unprecedented in European history. A woman who wielded absolute power through absolute ruthlessness. But the cost of that achievement was becoming apparent as France descended into the kind of chaos that even Catherine's political skills might not be able to control. The religious wars that followed the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre would test every lesson Catherine had learned about political survival, every relationship she had built during her rise to power, and every assumption she had made about the nature of royal authority. The woman who had mastered the art of political manipulation was about to discover whether those skills could preserve a kingdom that was rapidly tearing itself apart. The aftermath of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre revealed the true cost of Catherine's ruthless pragmatism. While she had successfully eliminated the Protestant political leadership that threatened her authority, the bloodshed had transformed France into a kingdom where trust between ruler and subject had been permanently shattered. The woman who had built her career on careful manipulation and strategic patience now found herself governing through naked force. And force alone could never provide the stability she had spent decades trying to achieve. Charles IX's deteriorating mental state became Catherine's most immediate concern. The young king who had once dreamed of military glory was now haunted by nightmares of the massacre he had authorized. Court physicians reported that Charles suffered from violent tremors, unexplained fevers, and episodes where he would wake screaming about blood on his hands that only he could see. The psychological trauma was so severe that Charles began questioning whether he deserved to rule a kingdom he had helped drench in innocent blood. Catherine watched her son's decline with the calculating eye of someone who understood that royal weakness invited political challenges. She arranged for Charles IX to receive the finest medical care available, but she also began preparing for the possibility that his reign might end prematurely. The succession would pass to her third son, Henri, Duke of Anjou, who was currently campaigning against Protestant strongholds in southwestern France. Henri was more politically sophisticated than Charles IX had been, but he was also more independent-minded and less susceptible to maternal influence. The challenge of managing Henri's ambitions while preparing him for potential kingship required Catherine to employ all the skills she had developed during her rise to power. Henri was already 21 years old and had established his own network of supporters among Catholic nobles who viewed him as a more reliable defender of Orthodox Christianity than his moderate mother had been. If Charles IX died, Catherine would need to ensure that Henry's reign served her interests rather than providing opportunities for enemies to challenge her continued influence. Her solution was characteristically sophisticated. Instead of attempting to control Henri directly, Catherine began positioning herself as his indispensable advisor by making herself the only person who fully understood the complex political situation he would inherit. She provided him with detailed intelligence about Protestant military capabilities, foreign diplomatic initiatives, and domestic noble loyalties that no other advisor could match. Henri found himself relying on his mother's information networks, even when he disagreed with her policy recommendations. Meanwhile, the Protestant resistance that had survived the massacre was evolving into something far more dangerous than the political opposition Catherine had previously faced. The Huguenots who escaped the bloodshed were no longer interested in religious compromise or constitutional reform. They had witnessed the monarchy's capacity for systematic extermination, and they understood that their survival required the complete overthrow of Valois rule rather than accommodation with it. The new Protestant leadership was exemplified by François de Lannoy, a military commander who had lost his left arm fighting royal forces, but had gained something far more valuable: absolute clarity about the nature of the conflict. Lannoy understood that the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had transformed the religious wars from a struggle over political influence into a battle for physical survival. Protestants could no longer afford to trust royal promises or accept limited concessions, because Catherine had demonstrated that such arrangements were merely temporary expedients that could be revoked through violence whenever circumstances made elimination more advantageous than negotiation. Lannoy began organizing Protestant resistance around principles that directly challenged the legitimacy of hereditary monarchy itself. He argued that rulers who murdered their subjects forfeited any claim to divine authorization, that resistance to tyrannical authority was not only justified, but morally obligatory. This ideological framework transformed Protestant military campaigns from rebellions against specific royal policies into revolutionary wars, aimed at establishing new forms of government based on religious rather than dynastic authority. Catherine recognized that Lannoy's approach represented a fundamental threat to everything she had built during her political career. Traditional methods of co-opting opposition leaders through bribes, threats, or strategic marriages were useless against enemies who viewed any accommodation with royal authority as collaboration with evil. She couldn't negotiate with revolutionaries who believed that her very existence was incompatible with their salvation. And she couldn't intimidate people who had already accepted that death was preferable to submission. The military campaigns that followed the massacre revealed both Catherine's strategic brilliance and the limitations of governing through fear. Royal forces commanded by Henri, Duke of Anjou, achieved tactical victories that demonstrated superior organization and equipment. But they couldn't achieve the kind of decisive triumph that would end Protestant resistance permanently. Every Protestant stronghold that fell was replaced by two others in different locations. Every captured leader was succeeded by someone more radical and less willing to consider compromise. The Siege of La Rochelle in 1573 became a symbol of this new phase of the religious wars. The Protestant fortress city had been transformed into something approaching an independent republic, with its own government, military organization, and diplomatic relationships with foreign Protestant powers. Catherine understood that capturing La Rochelle wouldn't simply eliminate another enemy stronghold. It would demonstrate whether royal authority could prevail against revolutionaries who had rejected the fundamental assumptions that made traditional monarchy possible. Henri's conduct during the siege revealed both his military competence and his political ambitions. The young duke employed innovative tactics that maximized the effectiveness of royal artillery while minimizing casualties among his own forces. His success enhanced his reputation among Catholic nobles, who were beginning to view military leader him as France's most capable. But Henri also began making independent decisions about siege strategy without consulting Catherine, suggesting that he was preparing to assert greater autonomy over military affairs. Catherine found herself caught between pride in Henry's achievements and concern about his growing independence. She needed him to succeed at La Rochelle to demonstrate royal strength, but she also needed to ensure that his success didn't provide him with enough prestige to challenge her authority over policy decisions. Her solution was to position herself as the strategic architect behind Henry's tactical victories, taking credit for the planning that made his battlefield success possible, while allowing him to receive public recognition for the actual fighting. The siege dragged on for months as Protestant defenders demonstrated the kind of fanatical resistance that Catherine had feared the massacre would inspire. La Rochelle's population preferred starvation to surrender, viewing their suffering as religious martyrdom rather than military defeat. Foreign Protestant powers provided enough supplies and reinforcements to keep the city functioning, while making the siege far more expensive for royal forces than Catherine had anticipated. More troubling for Catherine's long-term position, the extended siege was creating financial strains that threatened to bankrupt the royal treasury. Military campaigns against determined enemies required resources that France couldn't sustain indefinitely, and the massacre had eliminated many of the wealthy Protestant merchants who had previously provided loans to the discovering crown. Catherine was that ruling through fear was not only morally costly, but financially ruinous. The crisis deepened when reports arrived from Poland announcing that Henri had been elected King of Poland by the Polish nobility. The offer represented an extraordinary opportunity for the Valois dynasty to extend its influence into Eastern Europe. but it also threatened to remove Catherine's most capable son from French affairs at precisely the moment when his military leadership was most needed. Henri would need to travel to Poland to claim his new throne, leaving Charles IX without his most effective general, and Catherine without her most reliable ally in managing royal policy. Catherine's response to the Polish election revealed the global scope of her political thinking and her willingness to sacrifice short-term advantages for long-term strategic gains. Instead of preventing Henri from accepting the Polish crown, she encouraged him to view the opportunity as a stepping stone toward even greater achievements. Poland's elective monarchy provided lessons about alternative forms of royal authority that could prove valuable if circumstances ever required the Valois dynasty to adapt its methods of governance. More immediately, Henri's absence from France would provide Catherine with opportunities to reassert her direct control over military affairs, without appearing to diminish his achievements or challenge his authority. She could present herself as the temporary custodian of his strategic vision, rather than as someone who was usurping his rightful position as the crown's principal military commander. The arrangement required careful management of competing interests and personalities. Catherine needed to convince Henri that accepting the Polish crown served his ambitions, while ensuring that his departure didn't create opportunities for other nobles to challenge royal authority during his absence. She had to maintain the siege of La Rochelle without Henri's direct leadership, while preserving the reputation for military effectiveness that his previous victories had established. Her solution involved promoting subordinate commanders who had served under Henri's direction, presenting their continued success as evidence of his superior strategic planning rather than their independent capabilities. Catherine positioned herself as Henri's representative, who was implementing his designs rather than making her own military decisions, maintaining the fiction that he remained in control of French military affairs even after departing for his Polish coronation. The strategy worked brilliantly in terms of maintaining political stability, but it couldn't address the fundamental problems that the religious wars had created for French society. The siege of La Rochelle finally ended in 1573, with a negotiated settlement rather than military victory, as both sides recognized that continued fighting would exhaust their resources without producing decisive results. Catherine had preserved royal authority, but she hadn't eliminated Protestant resistance or restored the kind of domestic tranquility that would allow France to pursue normal political development. Charles IX's death in May 1574 marked the end of an era in Catherine's political career. The young king, who had been her instrument for consolidating royal authority, died believing that the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had been a necessary evil that preserved France from Protestant revolution. His final words to Catherine reportedly expressed gratitude for her guidance and confidence that Henri would prove an even more capable ruler than he had been. But Charles IX's death also created new challenges that tested Catherine's ability to manage royal succession during a period of ongoing civil war. Henri was in Poland, claiming his new throne when news of his brother's death reached him, creating a potential succession crisis that enemies could exploit to challenge Valois legitimacy. Catherine needed to maintain government continuity while Henri travelled back to France, ensuring that his coronation would proceed smoothly despite the continuing Protestant resistance and the financial strains that years of warfare had imposed on the royal treasury. Her management of the interregnum between Charles IX's death and Henri III's coronation demonstrated the dispensable to French administrative skills that had made her in governance. Catherine maintained diplomatic relationships with foreign powers, supervised military operations against remaining Protestant strongholds, and coordinated the elaborate ceremonial preparations that would mark Henri's return to France as the new king. She handled every aspect of royal administration with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment throughout her political career. Henri III's arrival in France in September 1575 marked the beginning of the final phase of Catherine's influence over French politics. The new king was more intellectually sophisticated than his predecessors and more aware of the political costs associated with the harsh methods that had characterized royal policy since the massacre. Henri understood that France needed domestic peace to address the economic and social problems that years of religious warfare had created, and he was prepared to consider approaches that emphasized reconciliation rather than continued military campaigns. Catherine found herself in the unfamiliar position of advocating for more aggressive policies than those preferred by the king she was supposed to be advising. Her experience with Protestant resistance had convinced her that religious compromise was impossible, that any concessions would be interpreted as weakness that invited further challenges to royal authority. She argued that Henri's inclination toward moderation reflected dangerous naivety about the nature of revolutionary movements that could only be defeated through sustained application of superior force. The disagreement between Catherine and Henri III represented more than a tactical dispute about how to handle Protestant resistance. They were operating according to fundamentally different theories about the relationship between royal authority and popular consent. Catherine believed that successful rulers imposed their will through whatever methods proved effective, while Henri III was beginning to think that legitimate monarchy required some degree of voluntary acceptance by the governed. Their conflict came to a head during discussions about religious policy that would define Henri III's reign. Catherine advocated for continued persecution of Protestant communities until they either converted to Catholicism or emigrated from France entirely. Henri III preferred a policy of limited toleration that would end the religious wars while preserving Catholic dominance in French society. Each approach reflected different assumptions about whether France could survive as a religiously diverse kingdom, or required the kind of uniform trying to achieve throughty that Catherine had been systematic violence. The resolution of their disagreement would determine not only the future of French religious policy, but Catherine's continued influence over royal decision-making. At 66 years old, she had survived every challenge that European politics could present and had established herself as one of the most powerful women in European history. But her final test would be whether she could adapt her methods to serve a king who questioned the assumptions that had guided her entire political career. The woman who had transformed herself from powerless orphan to absolute ruler was about to discover whether the skills that had brought her to power could preserve that power when circumstances required her to govern through persuasion rather than fear. The poisoned Queen of France had mastered the art of political survival, but survival in Henri III's reign would require her to prove that she could be something more than simply the most dangerous person in any room she entered. But the religious wars that had defined Catherine's mature political career were entering a new phase that would test every lesson she had learned about the nature of power and the price of survival. France remained divided between Catholics and Protestants who viewed each other as existential threats, but both sides were exhausted by decades of warfare that had produced no clear victor. The challenge facing Catherine and Henri III was whether they could construct a lasting peace that preserved royal authority while addressing the grievances that had made civil war seem preferable to political accommodation. The answer to that challenge would determine Catherine's historical legacy and France's political future. The Italian princess, who had learned to survive among powerful men, was about to face her ultimate test, proving that she had learned not only how to acquire power, but how to use it in service of something greater than her own survival. So there you have it, the extraordinary, true story of Catherine de' Medici, the woman history remembers as the Poison Queen of France. From that terrified 8-year-old girl trapped in a Florentine convent while rebels debated throwing her from the city walls, to the absolute ruler who orchestrated one of the most infamous massacres in European history, Catherine's journey reveals something profound about the nature of power and the price of survival. The real Catherine wasn't the cackling witch of popular imagination, brewing deadly potions in some dark tower. She was something far more complex and far more terrifying, a brilliant political mind shaped by a world that showed no mercy to the weak, no matter their age or gender. Every smile that hid a dagger, every feast that could be her last, every moment of her life was a calculated move in the ultimate game of survival. Catherine de' Medici proved that in a world designed to destroy powerful women, the only way to survive was to become more ruthless, more calculating, and more dangerous than any man who dared to challenge her. She didn't just break the rules, she rewrote them entirely, transforming from victim to victor through sheer force of will and an understanding of human nature that bordered on supernatural. Whether you see her as France's savior or its destroyer, one thing is undeniable. Catherine de' Medici mastered the art of political survival in ways that still influence how power operates today. The Poison Queen earned her title not through exotic toxins, but through something far more deadly: the complete mastery of political manipulation in service of absolute power.